when it comes to the national forests, a lot of the root of the crisis that we have going on today, it stems from their creation when they moved them from being in the national reserves that had been set aside by President Harrison and then Roosevelt and Taft and created the National Forest System and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they put these national forests under the USDA's charge. What they did was they put an agency in charge of those forests that views them as the nation's timber farm. And instead of viewing them as forest ecosystems, they're a farm.
Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. This episode, our guest is Jeff Stant. He is Hoosier National Forest Program Advisor for the Indiana Forest Alliance, of which he was Executive Director for 12 years. He was also Executive Director of the Hoosier Environmental Council and has more than 30 years experience in conservation and land management issues regarding national forests. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast, Jeff.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So we invited you on because there was a victory in the Hoosier National Forest, which is in Indiana, and I know some of the details. I don't know a lot of the details, so I wanted to have you on to not just educate our listeners, but to educate me, because I want to know more about what happened, what we can learn from this, its context, its importance. So what just happened?
Well, we had the Federal District Court for Southern Indiana halt the Houston South Vegetation Management and Restoration Project on the Hoosier National Forest, halt all aspects of it. And this is the third time the court has halted this project. And we're currently now trying to figure out the remedies. The court is going to ask all the parties to offer remedies for what it should now do. But what the court found, this Judge Tanya Pratt, Circuit Court Judge Tanya Pratt, the senior judge in the Southern District, what she found was that the U.S. Forest Service's supplemental environmental assessment that authorized the project to go forward for the third time violated the National Environmental Policy Act. Because the agency failed to take a hard look at the impacts of this project on Monroe Reservoir, which is the drinking water, sole source drinking water supply for more than 130,000 people. And it's also the sole domestic and industrial water supply for a broad stretch of the south central Indiana area that surrounds it. The Houston South project is the largest project that's ever been authorized by the U.S. Forest Service, largest logging and burning project in the history of the Hoosier National Forest. There's another project very similar to it that's been proposed called the Buffalo Springs Project. And a lot of the same, it's proposed on very similar hilly terrain, also surrounding the other major surface water supply in southern Indiana, Patoka Reservoir. And so we think the Judge Pratt's decision on the Houston South project, which had already been approved, will have a major effect in stopping what the Forest Service was intending to do with the Buffalo Springs project as well. Which affects an even larger area. If that project was approved, it would exceed 15,000 acres in size. This one is the Houston South project was proposing to burn 13,500 acres, log about a little more than 4,000 acres. 400 acres of that was by clear cutting, and a lot more acres were by shelterwood cutting, which is a delayed form of clear cutting, and then about 2,000 acres of herbicide application, and I mentioned the burning on 13,500 acres. The whole focus of the project was to quote, restore the oak hickory forest type to the area. And our contentions were that the oak hickory forest type is a transient part of the mixed central hardwood forest ecosystem, and that there are many other native tree species in the area, and the burning, the cutting, the use of herbicides is all designed to reduce biodiversity and put nature in a straitjacket, and cause a lot of environmental harm to the area. And part of that harm was pollution of the streams that drain these sites. Almost all this logging was on hilly terrain, much of it on very steep terrain, exceeding 40 degrees in slope, very steep for Indiana, fragile soils, highly erodible soils. And the court ruled that the Forest Service's reliance on the assertion that if they just follow BMPs, they'll reduce pollution to negligible levels, was not a hard look. That wasn't a sufficient examination of the impacts that the National Environmental Policy Act required. Project of this size. And you have to remember these streams that are draining the Houston South logging areas and burning areas are all going into the South Fork of Salt Creek, which provides 30% of the volume of the water in Lake Monroe or Monroe Reservoir. And that reservoir is already officially listed as impaired under the Clean Water Act for high levels of sediment and algal blooms that result from all the nutrients that are on those sediments. And so what we were saying is that this size of magnitude of project on these steep slopes, all draining into the South Fork, could easily exacerbate this stressed condition. The Forest Service needed to do an adequate examination of them under the of the impacts under the National Environmental Policy Act. And that meant it needed to do a full environmental impact statement. So we were saying these effects were significant and a full EIS was required, and that the Forest Service failed to take a hard look at the impacts, a whole host of impacts, but particularly the impacts on Lake Monroe. The court found that there was no question that they did not take a hard look at these impacts. They also found that the Forest Service didn't say the project wasn't going to be significant in scope. What it maintained was that, well, we could just follow best management practices, and that will minimize those impacts to a negligible level. And the court found that it was relying on broad statements about BMP effectiveness without examining what kind of BMP should be used and looking at the site-specific situations under which they would be applied for it to reach its conclusion that there'd be negligible impacts. And the court said that wasn't a serious look. I hope this is making sense. They never ruled on whether a full EIS was needed. They said we're not even going to get to that because the Forest Service failed the first test, which was just to analyze, look sufficiently at the impacts of the project on the drinking water supply.
Great. Thank you for that summary. That really explains the situation and gets me up to speed for sure. So this is primarily about the sediment and erosion from logging and how that would pollute, contaminate drinking water sources. That's the main thrust of this?
Yes, that's the main thrust of the court's ruling. That's right.
Okay, that's excellent, because at least out in the West here, we're dealing with a lot of, we have to log watersheds to protect the watersheds. Of course, they're using that under the guise of wildfire, et cetera. So basically a practice logging, which for sure will dump sediment. And I've even taken photographs of that happening, some fuel reduction logging, sediment going into these streams that directly feed a drinking reservoir. And they're saying because there might be a fire that might at some point possibly erode, et cetera. So I wonder, do you feel as if this might be extrapolated elsewhere? This could set a precedent elsewhere, or is this particularly local focused?
Well, I think I hope, I'm not an attorney, but from our discussions with our attorneys, we think this was a very good um, finding for the Seventh Circuit in particular, which is a conservative federal court circuit that doesn't have a lot of good NEPA case law for the environmental community established. And this decision was a real strike in our favor, so to speak, for saying that agencies have to take an adequate look at the impacts of their projects. They can't just say, hey, there's these BMP studies that have been done that are about other regions and or that are looking at a tiny pilot projects and say, based on that, we can just apply BMPs here across the whole 20 square miles and of logging on hilly and burning on hilly ground, and that'll be sufficient to say there won't be any pollution. And so, given that the Forest Service has projects all over the National Forest System that are doing that are making these broad brush statements about BMPs will just eliminate the harm. We think this could be very beneficial to folks elsewhere that are dealing with the same kinds of problems. Certainly, we feel it will help the people down in Orange County who are fighting the Buffalo Springs project, which is very similar in its scope and its impact, even larger in some respects. And it's unlike the Houston South project, which is a few miles back from the flood pool level of Monroe Reservoir. The Buffalo Springs project is going right up to the shoreline of Patoka Lake, Patoka Reservoir. So, we think that the precedential value of this decision could be very beneficial to people who are trying to protect water supplies in the national forests and conserve wild forests in the national forest system. But I should say that we still haven't gotten the remedy worked out yet. The judge hasn't ruled on that. Everything's on hold, but the remedy, she hasn't decided on the remedy, and that it's entirely possible that the U.S. Justice Department will appeal her decision to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and they may overrule her decision. We certainly hope they won't. We think her decision was well grounded, but assuming it holds, this is good news. People who are trying to rein in the excesses of the Forest Service on our national forests.
No, it's excellent news. Basically, you folks are acting as goalies, and they tried to take a shot, and you batted the ball or the puck or whatever, what have you down.
Me. Yes.
So
Sorry.
that's quite excellent. So I'm really glad to hear about that. And the way I always look at things is, of course, we have to protect our local natural areas. This is something we have to say, look, this is my ecosystem. This is where I'm here. I'm going to defend it. But then I'm always thinking, because I work nationally on this, how does this apply to other eco regions? And I think you're exactly right in terms of if the Forest Service can't get away with that over your neck of the woods, that might apply elsewhere, particularly because they are getting some of their funding yanked. Oddly, they're both being encouraged to do more logging by the Trump administration, yet also money is being taken from them, the typical Trump administration foot on the brake and the gas at the same time. So hopefully this works well. Maybe this can be just at the very least, a reminder to the Forest Service. Maybe they shouldn't, keep targeting new areas, and maybe they'll back the heck up and realize it might not be worth the while because of the strong defense that you folks have been putting on. So well done with that.
I mean, if Another good effect it could have um, is that the size of the project is unprecedented in for Indiana. The House and South project, um, and the Buffalo Springs project also. These are the largest projects that have ever been proposed in the history of the Hoosier National Forest. They're 3 times larger than the largest projects before them. And in those projects before them, I'm thinking of one in particular that these are actually 6 to 7 times larger than. They did a full EIS for the project that I'm thinking of down at the southern end of the forest in the Buzzard Roost area. Um, and what they've decided to do from like 2015, 2016 on was create massive projects that would involve every logging and burning area in that whole part of the forest, and get it all approved in one fell swoop, and then do it using the NEPA review process. The review process required under the National Environmental Policy Act, in a very streamlined way. Say all of it has no significant impact because we already had a forest plan that authorized us to do this, even though that forest plan specifically said that we're not going to look at site-specific impacts of the alternatives. We're saving that for when the plan's implemented through specific projects. So it didn't take a close look at the impacts of these projects when they adopted the plan, the EIS that went with the management plan. But it said you'll do that later when we do the projects that we're going to authorize here with this plan. And then later, when you get to the projects, the Forest Service, one of its big defenses is, well, we already did an EIS on this back when we did the plan, so we don't have to look at these impacts with it in a really close way, take a hard look at them, because we've already taken that look when we did the plan. Well, you can't have it both ways. At some point, they have to take a hard look at the impacts of their management activities on the forest, particularly when they're this massive. They were proposing to cut in areas at House and South where the age of the forest is beyond 200 years old. Now, in Indiana, to have public forest land where you've got chestnut oak stands that are 200, 217 years old, 180 years old, that's the age of the co-dominant trees that they're coring. You're knocking down something that is exceedingly rare in Indiana, in fact, in the entire eastern United States. And so to say that that's insignificant impacts, as the Forest Service has done, when the amount of fragmenting the forest they were going to do here, the fact that this forest doesn't burn naturally. You get lightning strikes here. At most, you might get a ground fire that it burns a half acre before the forest puts it out. The forest is much wetter than the western forest ecosystem, and so they don't. The Forest Service's own database shows that of the 400 plus fires that they've had in the Hoosier in the last 20 years, 3 of them were from lightning strikes, according to the Forest Service. They burned a total of 1.5 acres. So then when they go from that to saying now we're going to burn, between these 2 projects alone, almost 30,000 acres, and we're going to burn it all 3 to 4 times over a 15-year period, that's a significant change. And, you're talking about burning up a lot of creatures out here that evolve on the ground or in the forest duff layers. And it's all designed to reduce biodiversity, not native biodiversity, to kill off more than 80% of all the tree species in the Hoosier National Forest, in the native hardwood forests of the HNF. So, these are projects with huge impacts. And what to get to the point of what I'm trying to say is, had the Forest Service just said, look, we're going to do a 200-acre logging project over here where we're going to do group tree selection and we're going to burn also, I don't think that they could have done part of the House and South project started it, 5 or 6 years ago, and no one would have given them a whimper over it. They could be 4 or 5 projects into it now, and they would have not had any of the resistance that they created by then saying, well, forget that. We're going to do 13,500 acres here, and we're going to log 4,200 acres of it, and almost 1,000 acres of that by either shelter wood cutting or clear cutting, and we're going to spray herbicides on 2,000 acres of it. And since we know that we're going to create a huge non-native invasive plant problem from all these activities, we're going to broadcast spray these same herbicides over thousands of additional acres. That's what their proposal here is, and to build a road and skidder trail networks of hundreds of miles over this area to do it. And then to say that's not significant in impact. I mean, the court just looked at that and Pratt just shook her head and said, well, this on the question of the impacts on Lake Monroe, you clearly haven't taken a hard look. The project is entirely halted. And so I think what it's saying, the Forest Service, is if you're willing to proceed more conservatively with smaller size projects that you do a better job monitoring on and demonstrating their success of, then you're probably going to be able to proceed without a problem. But once you turn them into these giant mammoth projects, you should look for problems. That the public is going to fight them because they know this isn't right. And the chances are, even in a conservative federal court district, the public may win.
Yeah. Well, it might be that they have to do the bigger projects for any return on investment. In other words, if they tried to do these smaller ones, maybe there wouldn't be enough bang for the buck. So this is kind of their Hail Mary pass, and you folks are showing them that this is not going to fly. So that's promising.
Well, if they're going to do these bigger ones, then what this decision is saying is you got to do a much better analysis than what you did here. And NEPA means something. It's not yes, the Supreme Court is saying the court's not supposed to substitute its judgment for that of the agency, but the Supreme Court is not saying that NEPA is a meaningless paper shuffling exercise. It's saying you have to show that you did do the analysis. And this court, takes its job seriously there and making sure the Forest Service has done its analysis. And when it looked at the NEPA, at the BMP reports it was relying on, it concluded that it clearly did not do the analysis that the law required. So
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I have a question about some of the herbicide stuff. So this is to prevent regrowth after they do the cut. That's the premise behind the herbicides?
Yeah, the primary premise, this one that's discussed in the environmental assessment, and is that these are, point treatments, cut and treat, stumps. You hack and squirt. You're cutting, slashing some of the bark on a tree you want to kill, and you're putting the herbicide on that spot, or you're cutting down understory and then doing stump treatments on that. And so what the Forest Service is trying to say is we're using these herbicides very selectively. They're not going to spread off the site. And the problem with that is they also acknowledge in the project documents that the logging, the burning, and the road building are going to exacerbate an invasive problem that they acknowledge exists along the existing roads and trails in the area. That they're going to have a lot more garlic mustard, Japanese stiltgrass, bush honeysuckle, firebush, autumn olive. Everything is going to be worse. Multiflora rose, and you see that when you walk across cuts everywhere in the Hoosier, or you even walking down trails now. They acknowledge that there's a problem with that, but they say we'll deal with that by using the same herbicides that we're going to do in these hack and squirt operations around when we do the cutting. We're going to use those same herbicides on these invasives. Well, you don't treat Japanese stiltgrass by applying a little bit of herbicide to each stem. You broadcast spray it. And so that's the problem there. That's why, but they don't discuss it any further other than to just acknowledge we'll handle that by broadcast applications of the same herbicides, of glyphosate, triclopyr, and one other one. And we pointed out in our comments on the project that, there's very recent studies done on showing the impacts of the adverse impacts on pregnant women in Indiana and the Midwest from glyphosate that they're getting not only in their blood, but in their fetus's blood, resulting in premature births, low birth rates, and other complications in pregnancy. And that this is a pretty noted problem in the Midwest. And we brought up two very recent research reports, one from IU and one from another research institution, pointing this out. And the Forest Service doesn't even acknowledge, in its response to comments, that we brought these up. It just ignores it. That's what it did with a whole host of different issues, if you look closely at the project. I think this ruling, it augurs for the Forest Service having to account for public input, that particularly when it brings up relevant research to a project, that they can't just blow it off. They're going to have to speak to what the concerns are that are being raised there.
Yeah, and to me, the most alarming part about this is the Forest Service sets things up in a way that they harm ecosystems, they degrade them, and then they have to come in and say, well, we have to fix it now. So in this case, they're like, well, we have to cut these trees down, and there might be some invasives, at which point we're going to have to come in and do more and use more taxpayer money to justify our jobs.
Right.
So it's kind of like they're giving themselves job security by just continually messing up the ecosystem. And I think it's really interesting what you were saying about the oak hickory rather. The idea the Forest Service has of these snapshots in time where they think a particular forest is supposed to be like some Disney forest. They do it out here in the West in terms of ponderosa pine. They're like, it all has to be some open forest where you can walk through so we can photograph people, whatever their version of what they think a perfect forest should be. And it's sort of just like this outdated, arbitrary human view of the forest there. So
yeah, no, you're dead on there. That's exactly what they're doing here. They're not even they view people who are commenting that that are criticizing their comments in a very pious way, condescending response documents. And they talk about, the research shows the area was oak hickory. Well, then we go back and we look at the original government land surveys for the area that actually documented what trees were the dominant ones out there. And we find that 2/3 of the trees, the beech and the maple species outnumbered all the oaks and hickories combined by more than 2-to-1. And we had ash and elm and white walnut, black walnut, basswood, and all this other stuff in these forests. It was very mixed. And the same project documents where they falsely say we're trying to restore the native forest type, what they do, they claim that they're going to save biodiversity by doing this. But when all is said and done and you look at what they're really doing, you're forced to conclude that that's exactly the opposite of what they're really doing. They actually are trying to greatly reduce native biodiversity here by putting the forest in a straitjacket, by saying, it was always oak hickory. Well, no, it wasn't. And by saying if we can't maintain it as just oak hickory, that there's going to be an ecological calamity. Well, there's no basis for saying that. They can't point to a single area where there's been an ecological calamity from that. They selectively cite all these studies that show all the different species that rely on oak mast, but never cite. They never look at other tree species. And in fact, what you find when you start looking into that is that the land grant school system hasn't funded the research on, the number of invertebrates that depend on all the different ash mast the elms and the black gum and American beech and hop hornbeam and hornbeam. And, I could go on. We've got, in some single forest stands here in Indiana, in our mixed deciduous forest, we have 40 plus tree species, on a single elevation in 100-acre forest. I mean, that dwarfs diversity elsewhere. And what the Forest Service is doing is they're trying to go in and destroy that. And under this false ruse of saying, well, we're trying to save the natural ecosystem. Well, really what they're trying to do is destroy the natural ecosystem so that they can have highly profitable white oak and northern red oak stands that are forever white oak and northern red oak stands, because those are the highest value oaks in Indiana, and really on many measurements of the highest value oak in the world. It's right here in southern Indiana. And so they disguised their real economic motive with this ecological ruse that they create. And when you dig into it, you realize these guys they're using this, they're doing the same thing they've always tried to do here from the 1950s on, and that is to destroy the natural ecosystem. And then, like you said, then there's this huge new job that only they can fulfill, right? It's a job justification creation thing that just never ends.
Yeah, well, I had been long pointing out how the eastern forests, they're maturing, so they're getting back to really valuable timber, and they're certainly going after these forests like never before. I get really frustrated with the whole agencies pretending to be these saviors of ecosystems. I would like to go back to the day when they're like, listen, y'all, we're going to cut down some trees because it's economically viable, and then we're going to pump that into economies. At least that is an understandable argument, even if I don't agree with it. And I can point to all the other economic benefits of leaving forests alone and things that are a lot greater than that. But at least they're being honest to a certain degree. Now they're cloaking themselves in, we're the saviors of the forest. And I don't think it's fooling anyone who's paying attention, but I also don't think most people are paying attention. And a lot of places people don't realize that just because they have the word forest and service in their name doesn't really mean they're doing anything of benefit to either. But I wanted to ask you about the burning, because out here in the West, obviously wildfire is a component of the forests, and there is a ton of exaggeration about it. They're shoving in all kinds of logging and even some burning stuff, which maybe in some cases, if they're burning without the logging, is debatable. I haven't made up my mind 100% on that. I've seen a lot of data showing it's not legitimate or not effective. Regardless, at least out in the Western forest, you can make a legitimate argument saying fires come through usually every so often, blah, blah, blah. But in the Eastern forest, and they're even doing this in places like New Jersey now, Massachusetts, I'm going to be talking to somebody about that soon. This idea that we have to do all of this burning. So what is their justification for that? Also to bring back the oak hickory?
Yeah, that's a primary justification throughout the southern Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. It's oak has a thicker bark, internal bark, so it can survive fire better than the more mesic other tree species that live in more moist environments. So by burning, you're killing off its competitors, and you're also drying out the forest, so that species that need these dry, what we call xeric sites, can proliferate. Well, that's oak hickory. And so what they're doing, it's insane at a time when we need to be letting these forests, be their own microclimates to try to control their internal climates with these increased climate stressors. They're coming in and saying, well, let's exacerbate the hell out of the situation and turn this mesic forest into a dry forest. And that's and calling that ecological restoration. It's just completely ass backwards, and it gets to your other point you originally that really maybe it's the point I'm trying to make here, that it's really about justifying their existence. The forest is going to tend toward a more mesic condition as it ages. That's been a well-documented phenomena that ecosystems, the eastern hardwood forests, have been doing from time immemorial. They become more mesic with time. Even south-facing slopes and western slopes become more mesic as the canopy height gets higher, and you get multiple layers. And what they are trying to do is reverse that. And one of the best ways to do it is to use a disturbance regime that isn't natural. And fires is it kills, 4/5 of all the native hardwoods will disappear with time if you keep using it. So you end up with just an oak hickory type forest, and most of the understory will be completely gone after a while. And so you've got it's cleared out. It's a lot easier to just walk through any part of it. You've created a totally different environment. It's unnatural. Now, I'm not trying to say that fires never occurred in the eastern U.S. Certainly they've occurred for thousands of years, but when you look at the record, even fire ecologists like Mark Abrams and others will say, they'll acknowledge that usually where there were frequent fires, that was almost always around areas where Native American settlements were. And they, at least over the last 500, 600, 700 years, that was the case. The reason that we have some fire in Indiana was on the northern rivers of the state, the Wabash, the Mississippi, the Salamone. That's where the largest Native American populations were. They actually did some farming there. The Miami Indians, the Potawatomi, and then the Piankashaw further down the river. The Delaware and the Shawnee were kind of on ground that the Miami were letting them be on because they had been pushed west by the European settlement in the east and the Iroquois and so on. But the fires existed around those settlements where they were trying to keep land cleared for small openings for farming, or there might have been some areas where they hunted near their villages that they used fire for, because they recognized that the oaks had a preferential treatment by fire. But they survived it better, the idea that means that the natural system was being operated with disturbances like fire, that's never been documented by a single research report of the eastern hardwood forest systems. They always talk about, the Indians used it. Well, okay, that's not a statement that these forests burn naturally. The Indians used it, and when Europeans finally got to the Ohio River Valley, from Ohio all the way up to across the old Northwest Territory, clear up into what's today Minnesota, there were like 300,000 Native Americans at that point in that area, approximately. That's to say that these guys were burning most of that, every few years, is a ridiculous statement. There's just no data that backs that up. And even in our oak barrens region in the state, the studies that have been done on post oaks, because they have fire rings. Most of the other trees, don't survive fire and drop, so they can't, but they can study the prevalence of fires in the hardwood forest by looking at the post oaks. They're showing that unless there were Native American settlements around, there were no fire rings in those post oaks. So the fires existed in the East, but they did because there were Native American settlements there and Native American cultures there. And the incidence and frequency of fire greatly increased as European settlement pushed through. Our farmers, our forefathers, they used fire to clear areas and maintain it as being cleared. They used it far more than the Native Americans did. That's what the whole Smokey the Bear thing was about. It wasn't about stopping the Native Americans from burning. It was about trying to get all of the rural farmers in the eastern United States to stop burning their land so much. And it succeeded very well. But the Forest Service mischaracterizes that history to say, well, we got rid of the natural disturbance. And so these forests are all screwed up and we have to go in and start the burns again to bring nature back. And that's a complete falsehood. What we stopped was the unnatural burning of these forests by European settlers. And these natural forests have been coming back ever since. And the oak hickory that was favored by all that burning has been receding, and the more natural mesic forest, it includes some oak and some hickory, but not as much as the oak hickory that we created by all that burning and logging. That more natural forest is taking over, and the Forest Service is misleading the public, creating this scenario saying we've got to go in and log and burn this because this isn't natural. Well, no, it's exactly what was natural, and it's coming back. And what you're trying to do is stop it from coming back. That's what the Forest Service is really doing. And it's unfortunate that it's too detailed, too long of a story to tell to the mainstream media. But I guess your podcast is really the first time I've had a chance to really say this. I hope enough people are listening, and they probably already know this, as you're pointing. They probably are well aware of it.
Yeah.
I hope they are.
Well, no, it's a topic that needs more discussion. And yeah, I do think that the agencies like the U.S. Forest Service exploitation of indigenous cultures to just get out the cut, misappropriating it. You can call it cultural misappropriation, is what I heard somebody say. It's one of the more disgusting things that the Forest Service does. But the Forest Service has turned into, I mean, maybe it always was just a pack of lies. And I don't use that lightly. I think lots of people have their own views and perspectives on how the world should be, but there's no way that the Forest Service doesn't know that it's frankly full of shit on a lot of this stuff. And they just realize they can't get away with the old, we're cutting for commercial purposes. They have to cloak it under all sorts of, restoration, forest health, fuel treatment, whatever the hell they have, they're going to throw it.
Resilience. They love to use the word resilience now.
Right.
That's the buzzword.
All of the euphemisms. And unfortunately, they've been pretty successful at cowing the media. The media here in Colorado won't use the term logging to refer to their logging. And I even had an opinion piece published recently here, and the editor, without contacting me, changed log to thin. And I had to afterwards send him the map from the project that shows the Forest Service's own language, ground-based logging, steep slope logging. They're using the term, this person went above and beyond to run cover for the agencies because he was afraid of getting any sort of blowback. Pretty bad.
Yeah. Or that, I mean, silvicultural treatments are what they use that too. And you see the porters even kind of characterize. I mean, it's such a boring way of putting it. What the heck does that mean? But you're right that they're winning the battle of semantics. They are, what do you call it, semantically detoxifying their entire agenda. And I agree with you. I would rather they just be honest and say, look, we want to log these forests because we want to generate stands of white oak, and we want to make a lot of money from that because a large part of our agency is run from that revenue. And if you don't like that, go see the Congress and change the laws and make them appropriate more funds for us, or something like that, something more honest and transparent than all this BS about saving nature. It's such a cruel pack of lies. It's so opposite the reality. It's like, you see increasingly these days, politicians and the Forest Service, just like the politicians, it's like, they do something that's that's uh, that's heinous, that's awful, and they defend by accusing you of doing that thing. And as long as they get their word out first, they get the first barrage. It's like mission accomplished, because that's all the press really covers, is that first salvo. It's or our response is towards the end of the article, and it's kind of muted, or it's like we get one or two lines and they've got 22 lines.
If that. I mean, out here in
Yeah.
Colorado, it's pretty bad. And I don't want to get into the whole media topic because that's a whole other one. But I think that's part of why the agencies are winning these battles, is because they have the media as either just willing lapdogs, or I think it's often just that a lot of media does not have the expertise to really hash through this. And because they're trying to just pump out articles, they don't have the time. So part of it's ineptitude, but some of it is they've sided with the agencies. They've sided with, whatever their version of team sports is. And it's really upsetting. And yeah, they're basically writing fiction. I'm a fiction writer, but I say on my novels that this is fiction. And then I'm writing journalism. Those are two different things. The Forest Service has been masterful at basically writing novels, just short stories of fiction, and pretending like it's science, which it's not.
Yeah.
But they have to.
Yeah.
And I would say maybe we can take solace in that, knowing that they have to hide their intentions because the public has wised up to a certain degree. But their current version of this, it's a pretty good story that is tricking a lot of people. And out here in the West, I'm having a real hard time with folks who claim to be environmentalists who have really bought this stuff hook, line, and sinker. At the East, on the East Coast, it's maybe a little easier, but not much.
Well, we're battling a huge amount of people we used to work in tandem with, or as allies in, or we used to all think of ourselves as part of the same conservation community. And now they're buying the whole, we've got to burn these forests to save them. It sort of reminds me of, the adage of the Vietnam War, we have to burn this village to save it. They're doing the same thing with our forests. And you're right, it really is effective with people. I've talked to more politicians and their aides who, it's just a given assumption. It's a truth that they believe to be that, these forests haven't been thinned enough for so long that's why these fires are happening and they're so horrific. And the idea that people are moving out into these areas and that there's all this road access that wasn't there before, and that the numbers of that all just gets passed over, and the reporters barely talk about it. It's always, I see reporters on the mainstream media at night talking about the fires happening in these wild areas, and then you really look into it and you find that most of these fires are happening where people live. And when you look at the Jersey fire, for example, I've watched the way the reporters have covered the fires in New Jersey. New Jersey's pine barrens have always burned. It's in one part of the East where fire is part of the ecosystem, the pine barrens, and so sometimes the fires, they go a ways into the hardwoods. That's true. And there's other definitely parts of the East, the Southeast, that are to some degree fire dependent forest ecosystems. But even so, when there's a fire, you noticed how in New Jersey the coverage, they're talking about a fire that they're portraying it as this horrific fire, like it's just the same thing that's going on out west. And if you dig into it, you find that the size of the fire was 300 acres or 30 acres or something. It's tiny compared to what's going on out west. And these reporters, after several nights of coverage, have never bothered to mention that. that if you put the size of that fire on a map, you couldn't see it. It would be microscopic in size. It's depending on the scale of the map. You know, a state map of New Jersey, you barely see it. So it's a different situation. I'm not saying that fire isn't threatening. That population density is sky high in New Jersey, and yeah, it could. And that I think one person was killed, right, fighting the fire last year there. But the idea that it's the same everywhere, that forests are burning everywhere, it's so easy to convince the public of that now with climate change. You know, the scale of the fire in New Jersey is so much smaller than what's going on out west, and that you'd think the media would point that out at some point, but I haven't seen it pointed out at all. And people think New Jersey and the East is on fire just like out west, and it helps the fire addicts in Indiana push their agenda. I mean, we have so many fire staff, people on staff to burn the Hoosier National Forest now. I think there's more people on staff to burn it than there are in any other part of it. Definitely more than to manage the recreation. You know, the Dean Wilderness is one of the most heavily used wilderness areas in the East. You know, the Dean Wilderness and the Hoosier. And I think they have maybe one person on hand to deal with that. But last time I looked, they had 16 people on their fire staff. But why do we need 16 people on the staff in a national forest, you know, that covers a forest that doesn't burn naturally? I mean, you know, why not have a few that work with the local fire departments to train them to manage that, you know? But instead we have this battery of people that's what they live for, is the next prescribed fire. And we have this list of areas they're going to burn that's a mile long, and the Hoosier National Forest website. And it's depressing. One of the good things about this court battle is that a big chunk of those areas were in House and South, and they're now halted. But we'll see how long that remains to be the case.
It's a really promising victory on a really important issue, so I'm really psyched about it. Really appreciate all the work you've done on that, and for coming on the Green Root podcast, and of course all the work you've done over the years. So the last segment of the Green Root podcast that I'm doing now is tying into the title of the podcast, the Green Root, so the root of the ecological crisis. So what I'd like to ask guests now is, what do they think the root, or just a root, of the ecological crisis, or maybe a particular part of the ecological crisis? So Jeff, what do you think?
Well, I think when it comes to the national forests, a lot of the root of the crisis that we have going on today, it stems from their creation. When they moved them from being in the national reserves that had been set aside by President Harrison and then Roosevelt and Taft, and created the National Forest System and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they put these national forests under the USDA's charge. What they did was they put them in. They put an agency in charge of those forests that views them as the nation's timber farm. And instead of viewing them as forest ecosystems, they're a farm. And instead of viewing them through the lens of ecology, they view them through the lens of agronomy. And how do you grow straighter trees and more profitable trees? And then, of course, as you point out, now in the last 10 years, it's become really important for them to say, well, no, this isn't about harvesting trees. This is about saving them. It's all about ecological restoration, when really the agenda has always been the same. It's just they're using, ironically, the climate crisis to justify what they really want to do. They're twisting the science of the climate crisis to justify more logging and burning than ever before. And so I think the root of this goes back to the fact that you have agronomists managing a forest ecosystem. And that goes back to the way the forests were placed under the purview of the U.S. Department of Agriculture instead of the U.S. Department of Interior. I'm not saying there wouldn't be problems there too, but I don't think they would be quite as massive and far-reaching and putting us in a situation where you just have this complete dysfunction that the very people who we pay taxes to support, to manage the national forests, are actually hell-bent on destroying them or turning them into a crop. In Indiana, we don't have state soybean fields. We don't have state cornfields, and we don't need state tree farms. All of the public land put together in Indiana, federal, state, local, is like 7% of the land area of the state. The last thing we need to be doing here is competing with the state's timber industry, where 85% of the forest acres are, to produce, white oak saw timber. We ought to let them produce it on their land and maybe use the Forest Service to assist them. But when we have the Forest Service trying to, log and put logs on that market, that's just unneeded government. I'm very left of center. I see myself as a progressive who generally thinks government can be part of the solution a lot of the time. But when it comes to the national forests and the U.S. Forest Service, I would say I'm an arch conservative. I think these guys should be rendered back to custodial management, and the whole lot of them, said you're going to be laid off. That's where the OMB chief ought to be focusing on federal furloughs around and turning them into permanent layoffs right now. The U.S. Forest Service, and they would have a lot of support, I think, across party lines if they would do that. But of course, it's ironic they don't do that, right? They've got these guys will be some of the last guys they think of laying off, because the government, the problem is that the timber industry, that the whole system is set up to exploit these national forests for the good of private industry instead of the good of the people, the public interest, protecting water supplies like they were originally envisioned to do. And so that's where we come in, and so vital to this. But yeah, I think the root of this is that the U.S. is that the national forests were placed under the jurisdiction of the wrong federal agency a long time ago. The Muir-Pinchot fight ended wrongly. It ended in a way that the utilitarians, the Gifford-Pinchot, won out, and they put these what were national forest preserves at that time. Then they transferred them to the USDA that they were creating, and it's been downhill ever since.
Absolutely. That was really well said, and I couldn't agree more. So thank you so much for that, and thanks for everything. I really appreciate having you on.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.